today with a brief reflection on what has come before us. It is our intent to hold many truths in our conversation today and in our work going forward. We are still learning all of the ways in which our economic structure relied on poverty to build extreme wealth. Children have been used as a tool for power and control throughout history. Foster care was originally used as a punishment for people who could not pay their debt. Over time, this practice was rebranded as a way to rescue children from poverty. We know that persistent poverty is harmful to children, and we also know that the best solution to poverty, which is the lack of money, is cash assistance. Until we invest in eliminating poverty, we will continue to need to pour resources into rescuing children from its effects. We also know that our structures have kept some of us in poverty by design. We don't have to search hard to find policies that kept Black, Brown, and Indigenous families in poverty well after slavery was abolished, and some of these policies still exist today. From eugenics to forced assimilation, we know that the right to parent has been a privilege afforded to white, neurotypical, and able-bodied families with wealth. These complex intersections between race, sex, class, and ability status are painful even to name, but they are what we inherited, and we are living their legacy. It is also worth bringing the bravery, wisdom, and stories of those who have seen different paths into this conversation. As we sit here, I'm inspired by you, the visionaries, who see new possibilities before us. Naming the past harms creates an opportunity to offer something different. If we acknowledge that poverty is a policy decision, we can set the stage for new policies to be created and also implemented. It will take all of us, advocates, legislators, state employees, and impacted families to engage in these difficult and unpredictable, nuanced conversations in order to get this right. I look forward to seeing a safety net that is effective, adequately funded, and celebrated throughout Vermont. At this time, I'd like to invite Dr. Felicia Kornbluh to introduce herself and share some of her expertise.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here. Let's talk reach up. And I'm gonna share some slides. And I'll say by way of self-introduction that I am a professor of history and of gender sexuality and women's studies at the University of Vermont. And it's my professional, the risk of having someone with my professional background is that I might talk for 3 days about this stuff. So I will endeavor to not do that and to be super concise. But of course, if there's something about which I'm too concise, you can follow up with any questions either here or later on. I'm always happy to talk. So I am going to speak from the research expertise that I developed from writing 2 recent books. And I think each of the projects that I was involved in helps provide a framework for the way I think about the Vermont Reach Up program and what might be possible here, and how we should think about how we got to where we are today. So the first is a framework that's drawn from a book I published with the political scientist Gwendolyn Mink in 2018 called Ensuring Poverty, Welfare Reform in Feminist Perspective. And the first thing that I'll say, again, forgive me if I'm being too elementary here, but the first thing I'll just say for anybody who doesn't know is that the Vermont Reach Up program is our local version of a federal program called TANF, or Temporary Assistance for Needy Families. And that TANF program is sometimes referred to by the shorthand welfare reform, quote unquote welfare reform. So that was the welfare reform that my co-author and I were referring to in our 2018 book. And when we talked about feminist perspective, there were lots of different elements of the way that we analyzed TANF and its origins and its consequences as feminist scholars, but 3 of the key things were, first, that we understood that TANF program and its predecessors represented an understanding, a longstanding understanding, that custodial parents in America, especially mothers, were and are economically vulnerable. And that's systematic, it's structural, it's not a matter of individual fault or even individual bad luck. but that there's something structural and persistent about that. And that's where this program comes from that understanding. It also comes from an understanding of how sexism did and continues to work. And only one example of that is the way that we know that wages still aren't equal on the basis of sex, and women, as women are persistently discriminated against in the labor market as well as in other ways. And that has an impact on their ability to parent. We also analyzed this TANF program and its own origins as itself being motivated by sexism as well as racism and other kinds of isms. And I'll talk more about that in a minute. So that's one framework. The second framework I want to offer comes from my more recent work, and this is centered around a book that's going to be published next week, which is called A Woman's Life as a Human Life, My Mother, Our Neighbor, and the Journey from Reproductive Rights to Reproductive Justice. And much of the story of that book is about abortion rights and how abortion was decriminalized in the United States, starting from individual states and then eventually going to Roe versus Wade at the federal level. And you might say, how does abortion rights fit with the issue of TANF or with the economic vulnerability of custodial parents and their kids? And the way that it fits together is that by the end of the story that I'm telling, that is post Roe versus Wade in the late 70s and then 80s and then beyond into the early 21st century and up to today, there has been a politics of what activists and thinkers call reproductive justice, which goes beyond the matter of reproductive rights or abortion rights. And the essence of reproductive justice is that all people deserve the right to have children and to make relatively free choices about when and under what circumstances they will have children and raise children, as well as needing the right to refrain from having children, right? So it's abortion rights on one side of the page and the right to be free from certain kinds of controls on your ability to bear and raise children on the other side of the page. And what people discovered by the end of the 1970s and to the early 80s and have been arguing since then is that that kind of reproductive justice requires a certain degree of economic support, right? It requires an economic minimum that would allow people to make those choices freely or relatively freely, and it requires services to support them. So this is a kind of an understanding in the reproductive rights space that grew from the fight against sterilization abuse in the 1970s, which I chronicle in my book, and then grew into a larger framework for what was called in the 70s and 80s reproductive freedom, and then was renamed and kind of rethought somewhat in the 21st century as what today we still call reproductive justice. So that reproductive justice framework is, I think, an important one for thinking about Reach Up in Vermont. Just a little bit more about that. So within those frameworks, I see considerable grounds for optimism. And I also see grounds for pride about what's been happening in Vermont public policy. Despite what my co-author and I found about the sexist origins of the TANF program at the federal level, for example, in Vermont, around Reach Up, Vermont has already done much to ensure that the program is much better than the minimum that's allowed by federal law. So we should be proud of ourselves for that. And there's no reason to think we can't do more. Second, if we're thinking about reproductive justice, I think everybody who works in Vermont public policy knows that we have just had this extraordinary victory for what we've been calling reproductive liberty. According to VPR on the 9th of November, right, our reproductive liberty amendment to the Constitution passed with 76.74% of the Vermont electorate voting in favor, which is an extraordinary outcome. And I would say, if we're talking about reproductive justice, what activists have found is that even people who have moral concerns about abortion and who might not be part of this 76+%, do favor allowing people to choose when they do want to bear, birth, and raise children. And this, of course, means providing basic, obvious supports for parents and kids, like the supports that are contained in the Reach Up program. So that's the big macro level, my frameworks, and at least my reasons for optimism and pride. And again, I speak for no one but myself on this score. But that's the way I view Reach Up and our opportunities today. Okay, I am trained as a historian, so I'll do a very quick walk through history, a quick tour through history. At the largest level, I would say there has been a longstanding recognition in American history of the economic vulnerability of custodial parents, typically mothers, especially those with young children, and the economic vulnerability of women. And what this means is that there's been a long understanding of the need for a public governmental response, right? Sometimes we think back in the day, it was all about charity, or it was about families taking care of their own or taking care of themselves. Like, that's actually not true. At every point in American history, starting in the colonial period in the 17th century, going through the revolution and all the way through, there's been a public response because people understood that this is a typical structural thing that happens, that people who are raising young children have economic needs that aren't met by their families or by the labor market, right? And there have been a variety of different responses to that need, but they all are coming from that same recognition, right? And this is where Reach Up comes from. It's in this line of public programs that respond to parents and women's economic vulnerability. So we could go all the way back to the 17th and 18th centuries. That was done at the town level or the parish level. In the 19th century, there was so-called outdoor relief, financial aid, typically to moms and kids. And in the early 20th century, there were municipal and then state level programs of what was called mothers' pensions, which were the real precursor for the Reach Up program. 41 states on the eve of the New Deal were providing these so-called mothers' pensions, and then they were encapsulated during the New Deal period into the Social Security Act of 1935, which is kind of the heart of the New Deal legislation. And the program that was created in 35 was called Aid to Dependent Children, ADC. It was state administered, but funded through a combination of federal and state funds. And at the time, it was less controversial than other aspects of the Social Security Act of 1935, including old age insurance, which is the thing that we usually call Social Security, and even aid to the blind, which was the only benefit that was then provided to disabled people, and today is part of the SSI program. So what happens after 35? It becomes more controversial than it had been at the time of its passage. There's an increasing controversy around issues of race, sex, Latinidad, migration, and other variables. And there were multiple efforts at welfare reform in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and beyond. Two key ones were in 1967 and 1988. And both of those provided new work requirements, as they were called, for participants in the program. And all of those efforts at welfare reform culminate in the 1996 law that created TANF, or Reach Up in Vermont. That law is called the Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act of 1996, or the PRWORA. And it has been amended and changed somewhat since then, but that's the big federal law that we're talking about. And just a couple of the key features of it and some of the key elements of background to that 1996 law, which I think it's useful to know, is that that law did come out of Bill Clinton's 1992 presidential campaign, in which he made a promise to end welfare as we know it, as he put it, and that wound up being his most popular campaign claim everywhere he went. He got huge applause for saying, we're going to end welfare as we know it. And then when he was elected, he felt like he needed to make good on that promise and try to make it a kind of a moderate and liberal approach. But then the Republicans took both houses of Congress for the first time in 35 years in November of 1994, and they pressured very, very hard. And so what we wind up with is the PRWORA, or the TANF program, what becomes Reach Up, being signed by President Clinton in August 1996. And some of the key features back then were there was a federal time limit of a total of 60 months or 5 years for somebody to receive the benefit over their lifetime. There were exclusions in the program for legal immigrants, people here legally, and most of those were later rescinded. There were work requirements. And unlike the prior welfare reform, that 1988 law only limited provision for people to engage in educational and work training programs and to have that count toward their work requirements. So in 88, there had been kind of broad access to education, and that narrowed with this 1996 law. It was one of the things that advocates were most frustrated by. And I'll just end by saying there were some silver linings, were and are some silver linings in that law that we've seen play out in Vermont and in other states over the years. And the silver lining that is most important for us, I think, is that there was massive decentralization, right? Or what Ronald Reagan called the new federalism, neo-federalism, that was really at work here. And so the states were allowed a great deal of autonomy under this federal program, much more than under the old ADC, or it was, as it was later called, AFDC program in the 30s, 40s, 50s, et cetera, right? And that is problematic if you live in a state like Mississippi, where you may know there's been some big scandal around this program. And if you don't know, you should check out Ann Lowry's piece in The Atlantic on this. It's problematic in Mississippi, but it is a positive development in a lot of ways if you live in Vermont. And I'm sure others, will talk about this more, but in Vermont, there has been a lot of innovation. And there are great opportunities for innovation and expansion according to our values under this program. So the last thing I'll say is that I think we have an opportunity, we have had, and we continue to have an opportunity to make lemonade from lemons on this policy. I like the picture of the lemons. We have an opportunity here to create public policy that reflects the longstanding truth that custodial parents and women and children need economic support that is not provided in the conventional labor market and is not provided by their families. And we have an opportunity to respect and fulfill the value that most Vermonters place on reproductive liberty, and even beyond that, the value they place on reproductive justice. So thank you for that. Oh, and I will pass the gavel to Donna Pavetti, who is a great national expert on these matters, and it's so delightful to have her here to speak to us.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. I always enjoy being able to participate in Vermont. My son graduated from the University of Vermont last year, so I have spent lots of time in Vermont, and I'm always glad to do whatever I can to provide sort of put Vermont in a national context, which is what I want to do. So I'm going to in some ways pick up where Felicia left off in really trying to say, what does TANF look like today, and putting Reach Up in a national context to be able to, again, talk about both where are the opportunities and where are the strengths that already exist there. So I'm going to be pretty simplistic in doing this. I'm not going to use slides, but when I think about the federal TANF law and what that created, I think of it as having two sort of very core components. One is sort of the funding and spending side, so the money and how that flows and how it can be used, and the other is the policy aspects. So I'm going to start with talking about the funding and the spending aspect of that. So basically the way TANF works is it's a block grant. So it has been the same amount since it was created in 1996. And so it has lost more than 40% of its value. So you could not serve the same number of people, provide the same amount of money, and do what else was intended if you wanted to, because there just wouldn't be enough money to do that. In Vermont basically gets $47 million in federal funds every year and they are required, what's called a maintenance of effort obligation. They're required to spend $26 million of state funds. And you can look, there is sort of the state has to report every year on what they spend and how they spend that. And Vermont actually reports spending more money on the maintenance of effort than they are required to. And a number of states who are trying to do good things do that because it gives them some additional flexibility. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means, but that relates to the policy side. So what is really sort of striking in Vermont, as well as every other state in the country, is that if you look at the data, what has happened is that the amount of money that has been spent on basic assistance, which are cash grants to families, has declined dramatically. So even just sort of thinking about the state could have continued, any state could have continued to spend the same amount of money on basic assistance as they had available, but that is not what has happened. So in Vermont, in 2001, they basically spent $35 million on providing cash grants to families. By 2021, so last year, that had declined to $11 million. So that is a huge decline. And so the reason for that decline has two components to it. One is there's a declining value of the benefit. So the amount of benefits that are actually provided, the value of the cash grant. And Vermont's cash grant in 1996 was at about 58.5% of the federal poverty line. And that is now at 42.3% of the federal poverty line. So even if it may have gone up in actual dollar amounts, the value of it has declined pretty substantially. And so that value is, again, 25% less than it was in 1996. The other component of that is fewer families actually receiving assistance. So in 1996 in Vermont, for every 100 families in poverty, about 80 were receiving cash assistance. That has declined in 2020, which is the latest that we currently have data for. We're working on the 2021, was 71. I actually think that is a little bit inflated because of the pandemic. So there were more families that were in need and more families that were served during the pandemic. So I think when we get to 2021, we may see that number going down some. So the other thing that is important is that, and this is part of sort of the value and what it means, is that, you know, when you think about inflation and how much inflation has increased, Vermont had a benefit increase last year. But that has sort of happened every year. It was bigger in the last year than it has been, but it means you can buy less. And the other thing that has happened in Vermont and in other places is the price of housing has increased dramatically. And when you have that is one of the key costs that people have, all of us, right? It's one of our main expenses, is being able to pay either rent or a mortgage if you own. And so when that increases, then it becomes that much harder for families to make ends meet when they're receiving a fixed payment like Reach Up. And what happened to Reach Up is, basically, if you look at the fair market rent in Vermont, and looking specifically, it varies by county, but if you look at Rutland County, the assumption is that we should spend 30% of our income on housing. Whether that's a mortgage or whether rent. What it means is that the Reach Up grant currently, if you have that portion, allows you to afford 29% of fair market rent. So what that means is that it's hard for families to find housing. They end up in substandard housing, and they end up with all of the issues that go with that. So that it's unstable housing, families end up homeless. So it ends up just sort of defining their life in so many ways, because it creates so much of a struggle if you don't have safe, affordable, and stable housing. And that, we know, is just really sort of not good for kids in the long term. So, so where do the funds go? If Vermont has sort of stopped spending so much of its funds on cash assistance, where do they go? And I will just say that all states have shifted their funds, and some have done it in what we would think of better ways than others. And Vermont is a state that there isn't anything when you look at the spending and say, that is not something we would want to spend money on. So the places where Vermont spends their TANF funds, they spend it on childcare. That's the next large, one of the largest shares. They spend it on the refundable portion of the earned income tax credit, and they spend a smaller share than a lot of states on child welfare. That is not sort of the biggest. So those are all things that, you know, families need and we believe are part of it. But what TANF has done in pretty much every state is that things that would have been in the past really sort of perceived as state responsibilities and that the state would have had to spend more of their own money on, they have used TANF funds to fill those budget holes. Child welfare is an example of that. If TANF funds were not available in most states, states would be spending more general fund dollars on child welfare because that has always been primarily a state responsibility. Childcare, we know, is just broken across the country, and it is an area where we desperately need more federal funding, but also it is such a critical need that it ends up pulling money away from what could be spent on cash assistance. So what you end up doing is taking this fixed pot of money and having a fixed pie and trying to meet all these needs, and the pie never gets bigger. And so what that does is it really squeezes sort of what you can do and what you think about as what families needs to really be able to raise their kids in a way that really matters. The other thing that I think is important to put this into context is that the research on the importance of cash has just exploded in the 26 years since TANF was created. And we know that if families don't have enough income to meet their basic needs, there are just very significant long-term consequences. So it ends up creating more health problems in kids down the road. It results in increased costs in the criminal justice system. And so the negative consequences of not having enough income end up costing the state in other ways. And there's a study that was recently done by Columbia University where they showed that for every $1,000 you invest in providing increased cash to families, you recoup $5,000 over time. And again, most of that comes from increased earnings for families as kids become adults, reductions in costs in the criminal legal system, and in the and reductions in healthcare costs. And the healthcare costs are huge. So we know that when families when they struggle to make ends meet, when they don't have enough money for food, when they're living in poor conditions for housing, that all sort of contributes to health problems that really have lifelong consequences for kids. So that's sort of why really sort of paying attention to what's happening in the cash part of Vermont Reach Up program is really important. And what we have seen is several states that have really taken a position that no family that is receiving TANF should be living below 50% of the poverty line. So in deep poverty, that itself is a pretty low standard, but even that standard is a pretty big reach for a number of people. So just neighboring New Hampshire, basically several years ago, put a policy in place that every year their grant is adjusted, and it is adjusted to 60% of the federal poverty line. So it always keeps pace with inflation. It is the highest grant in the country, and they made a commitment that they felt that that was an important thing to do. California has also implemented policies where they're moving towards getting to 50%. They're currently at 48%, and there are several other states that are sort of in a process of moving in that direction. So the other thing that I want to do, and I'm going to do this a little, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, is the policy side. And I think this is sort of an area where Felicia sort of mentioned this, is that it's an area where Vermont should actually be quite proud. I think on the policy side, there are a lot of states that have really implemented very punitive policies and have really made the program a program that you wouldn't want a family to be a part of, because of the way they're treated, because of what they're expected to do to be a part of it. And the legislation that passed last year really set Vermont apart from the rest of the country in being the first state to really end what I like to refer to as work requirements that we have known them. So work requirements come out of a racist history that, sort of with punishment as the core, taking away family choice about what's best for their family. And the legislation that was passed last year really reverses that and really sort of creates a framework that says our program about helping families to set and achieve their goals is really going to be about helping families to think about what that is a huge shift from what was there before. And it also is a model for other states. So I'm working with some other states. I send the revised legislation to other states all the time to say Vermont did this and you can do it too. So I think that really is a bright spot. And I think it will take time for the state to actually implement that in the way that they want, that they feel it should be implemented. But again, it's on a path to create a program that really will help families to move to a better place than where they started when they come to Vermont. Because as we know, when many families come to Reach Up, they're in crisis. They're not coming, they're coming because they've lost a job, because they're fleeing domestic violence, they have lost their housing, their kids are sick. So there's really a crisis. And so if you create a positive sort of framework, what you allow is the opportunity to say, how can we help you get through that? And how can we help you to move forward to have a better chance of not having those crises happen in the future? So with that, I am going to turn it over to Olivia to talk more about the local context. And so Olivia, it's all yours now.
All right, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. My name is Olivia Graffeo-Cohen, and I'm a staff attorney at Vermont Legal Aid. My work is primarily in public benefits, including representing and advising Reach Up participants. Prior to joining Vermont Legal Aid, I worked as a fellow at the Greater Boston Legal Services Welfare Law Unit. And generally, I'm drawn to public benefits work because so much of what it means to participate and thrive in our society depends on money as a means of access. So I'm grateful to be here, kind of imagining and thinking about all of this with you. So because lawyers are most comfortable looking at laws, I thought I might turn us to some of the statutes that frame Vermont's program. So within the policy statute for the Department for Children and Families, which is the agency in Vermont that administers the Reach Up program, we have a pretty lovely sentiment in that law. It says benefits shall be so administered as to maintain and encourage dignity, self-respect, and self-reliance. It is the legislative intent that assistance granted shall be adequate to maintain a reasonable standard of health and decency based on current cost of living indices. So we want to make sure that we're providing benefits that allow Vermonters to live a decent, dignified life based on the realities of what it costs to live today. And Vermont's Reach Up statute also has a purpose section. It has I think it's a 10-point list of goals. And it has similar descriptions of how we want to ensure that people have what they need to live. And some of them specifically mention children. So the program is meant to improve the well-being of children by providing for their immediate basic needs, including food, housing, and clothing. It says that we're supposed to measure the success of this system by what is best for children. And we want to support parental nurturing. So I think those are all like a really lovely idea of what this program should be and should be doing for Vermonters. Also in those purposes, we can see the influences of the 1990s welfare reforms, where the ideal was really to reduce the use of cash assistance. So the law says that it's meant to encourage economic independence by removing barriers and disincentives to work and providing positive incentives to work. And it also says that Reach Up is meant to assist families, recognizing individual and unique characteristics, to obtain the opportunities and skills necessary for self-sufficiency. So there's still this ideal of, the best thing is to not need the program, but that's also within the context of what we've said about our values, which is that we want to make sure that there is this basic floor that nobody can fall below, where you're getting your basic needs met. There are some other bullet points about benefit cliffs and compliance with federal law, so I won't list all of them, but I wanted to start there because I think it sets up what is this program meant to be. We've heard some of the historical context for how TANF was designed. We know that Reach Up was created as a part of this reform movement that had very particular ideas about what families should look like and under what conditions we want to support them. So, at what point do we decide we no longer want to provide help? And some of that framework is set by federal law, but has already been described, states have a lot of flexibility, both in how we design specific eligibility rules and also how we spend our money. So there are lots of potential decision points when it comes to designing and implementing our program. And some of that happens in statutes and some of it happens in the agency regulations. And last year, as you heard, Vermont revised our Reach Up laws to remove the more stringent work requirements, move us toward a more flexible model of program participation. Those changes will go into effect in 2024, so we have another year. And it's a really positive shift. It moves us away from that kind of paternalistic social control policy designs. And really aligns with social justice movements that recognize individuals are making rational choices for their families given the barriers and institutional constraints that they're faced with. So that was a really positive step. But still, when we're thinking about that list of goals in our statutes, we're falling short in our commitments to families. And that's not just my opinion. We say it in our rules. So the law says that Reach Up benefit levels, when there's a section that's specifically about how much people should be getting from the program. And it says that we should provide that person, the applicant, a reasonable subsistence compatible with decency and health. But that promise in the law is limited to as far as funds are available. And so basically we need to put the money behind that goal. And so far we have not done that entirely. And so the way that statutory promise is implemented by the state agency, DCF, is that they created a calculation and they put it in their rules. And it gets really wonky and there's all sorts of specific rules, but I'll give you the basic framework. So first, the agency sets by rules certain amounts that a family would need to cover basic needs. And so I think it's tied to the consumer price index in some way. And our current basic needs standard was updated in 2021, I believe, to align with 2019 expenses. So it's not, it's not necessarily the same as like a Social Security cost of living adjustment. That's like a little more, that is automated. So right now we are manually updating with some lag time what we consider necessary for basic needs. In addition to that, the agency adds an amount, a housing allowance that is meant to contribute to housing costs. It is not tied to the metric of average housing expenses in your region. It's sort of a set amount. There's a little adjustment for Chittenden County. So you add those two together, the housing allowance and your basic needs. And then what Vermont does is we look at that total and we give families 49.6% of that total need, just under half. And that process of figuring that basic subsistence amount and cutting it, we call that the rateable reduction. It's outlined in the rule created by the agency because, and this is specifically in our rule, it says because funding is insufficient to meet 100% of the needs standard. So we know that we are not hitting that level of helping people with their even just essentials. That's not the amount we need to thrive, that's just survive. And in addition to that, the benefit can be reduced further due to other rules that basically impose penalties for running afoul of certain requirements. So one example is families can be subject to financial sanctions. It's a benefit cut, like just a dollar amount if you're out of compliance with participation requirements. There are also really punitive disqualification periods. So if someone receives a lump sum payment, like an inheritance while you're on reach up, that money people can't use that to get ahead because the rule says that money is meant to displace the reach up benefit for however months, it can be spread out in the future. So they run a calculation, you're not eligible for reach up during that period. You're supposed to use that lump sum immediately. And the only way to get around that is by spending it on a very short list of prescribed expenses. So like utilities, housing, car, major household appliances, which all seems reasonable, but other necessities like food or paying off credit card debt are not allowable. So the rules can still exert a level of control over families' choices on how to manage their time, how to manage their money. And it's not always intuitive. It's often more restrictive than other benefit programs. So families really have to become experts in navigating these systems. They have to maintain engagement, and sometimes they need to assert their legal rights in order to just retain that level of support that we already know is not at the level it needs to be. I am mindful of time, so I will skip a little bit and just say, we know that the purposes of the program are meant to let families live with dignity, to provide what's best for children. Right now, we're giving families less than half of what they need to live, and the dollar amount can be reduced even further, depending on how you navigate those rules. So we're really expecting children to live in severe poverty. As it stands now, like we've written these holes in our safety net explicitly into our laws and our regulations. So when we have a chance to think about opportunities going forward, we can decide to commit to community care. We can recognize that we have a chance to actualize some of those priorities we already have in our laws. We have the flexibility to do so under federal law. We just have to have the will to do it. And I will stop there and open us up to questions. There's action in the chat that I have not been following. So if someone else wants to raise it.
There are many, many great questions. I was thinking we would start off with the one for Dr. Kornbluh, just because we might not have her at the next session. Are you willing to jump in?
Yeah, sure. So the question is about stigma and some of the ways that people who participate in this program are often understood or treated in our public and political conversations. It is really hard. That's a legacy of what happened in the 60s and 70s. It's a legacy of what I'm afraid members of the Democratic Party in the 90s also permitted. And I think, I think at some point, some national Democratic figures are going to have to kind of plant a flag around this and say, it's no longer the 90s. And in a variety of ways, people have done that. But to say that particularly around this program, still waiting. In the meanwhile, I actually do think, and I know Voices for Vermont's Children has its own ways of kind of discursively talking about this program and its beneficiaries. Again, I speak only for myself, but I do think that thinking about it in terms of systematic, structural, very, very, very long-standing patterns really helps. If we think, I think people do know something these days, thanks to Me Too and other things, about what's going on in the labor market, and people know that there is systematic economic inequality and sexism that shows up in wages. And I think more and more people know that the labor market doesn't work. I mean, somebody was talking about childcare. I think Dr. Pavetti was talking about childcare. The childcare market totally doesn't work, right? The labor market also is kind of dysfunctional. It simply doesn't provide for people's needs. And I think there's a growing awareness of that, that thanks to a whole bunch of kind of structural and long-term things, even people who are participating full-time in the labor market are not receiving what they and their families really need. So I think it's important to understand this program in that context, and always to keep kind of pulling it back to the big picture. And I also personally, I love this reproductive justice idea, at least for Democrats and many kind of moderate centrist Republicans and independents, and in Vermont progressives. People are very inspired now by doing something in response to the overturning of Roe versus Wade and the Dobbs opinion and the threat that poses to our liberties. And I think we have an opportunity to have a conversation about preserving reproductive rights and liberties, and preserving the other side of the page, reproductive justice. And what does it mean? What does it mean to provide people with the economic wherewithal to make genuinely, relatively free choices about having children? When, whether, under what circumstances, with whom, is it going to be safe, etc. So I think all of that helps. And one more thing I'll just add, again, riffing off of what Dr. Pavetti said about the value of cash. We do have research that we didn't have in 1996, not just about the negative consequences of not having cash, but about the positive consequences of having cash. And we see, right, time and time again, when there are these kind of small scale studies, if you give custodial parents extra cash, they spend it on education and housing and very basic needs for their kids. And, all the indices go up. Like, there's no ambivalence about this in the research record. And I think that also helps. And anybody who cares about the UBI, universal basic income, and the positive consequences of that should also care about Reach Up and the TANF program, and using that as a vehicle for providing basic income support, especially to families with children.
Wonderful, thank you. And I know, Nate, you had a question, and if we have time, we will try to get to it today. If not, the next session we'll be talking about what Reach Up looks like now in Vermont, and we will definitely work your question into the piece. For now, I just want to highlight Christine's question, which was, flexibility is great. It also leaves a lot of room for individual discretion on decisions made by Reach Up staff, caseworkers, etc. What measures about fairness and accountability are there? How are complaints of racism and bad practices processed? And what data collection measures are in place so that these issues are addressed and resolved? I know, Dr. Pavetti, you have kind of the national picture of how this might work. And Olivia, you probably see some of the complaints that have been processed at Legal Aid. I don't know if either of you want to take this one on.
I don't have the best answer for this, and I think that it'll be interesting to see what happens as Reach Up, as Vermont implements the legislation from last year, because what has happened in TANF is that the only accountability measure that is in place in most places is whether or not states are meeting the federal work participation rate. So it's like how many people are participating, and there really isn't data collected on what are people's experiences, whether people are treated fairly, and what other measures of accountability. But I think that what happens is when you get away from the work participation rate as the primary or the only measure of accountability, it at least raises the question about what should the accountability measures be. So I think it is always hard to figure out, like, what should those measures be. I do think that one thing that there is an increasing interest and movement towards is trying to really listen more to the voices of people who are using the program, and really having that information integrated into decision making. And so I think that is one way to begin to get at that, because I think that people's experiences are different, and that allows you to really allow people who are experiencing the program to have a voice. And Maine actually implemented legislation a couple of years ago where they had a report that the state was required to do every year on outcomes. And they were successful, the advocates were successful last year in adding to that a requirement that the state also needed to incorporate the voices of people with who were using the program in that. So I think that is one way to begin to get at that. But I think this is very much an open question, and one thing that we don't have good examples in other states as well.
Yeah, and on the, I guess the more ultra local side, I can't speak to the internal processes that the department might have for complaints about how people are treated, or racism, or bad practices. When I was thinking about flexibility, I was thinking more on like the state level about what policies we're creating. But I definitely affirm this idea, like there is flexibility. There are words like good cause in our eligibility requirements that are just going to come up to like the one-on-one engagement with department staff. And I'm not sure what data collection there might be at the state. We see just such a tiny fraction of the people who are engaging with the Reach Out program at Legal Aid. And I think part of that is because trying to get legal assistance, even if you think something is wrong, is another barrier that you might be trying to navigate on top of all of the other things and programs you have to deal with. So I don't have a great reassuring answer for you, unfortunately, on that.
Great, and I think that Nate's question might take a little bit more time, and so I'm going to reach out to him after this piece and see if we can bring it into the next session, which is around sort of what does Reach Out look like in Vermont today. So we'll be joined by Julie from Public Assets, who will share a little bit about the financial picture. Paul Dragon is going to be joining us to talk about housing and the connection of the need for supportive housing to reach up, and Donna Bailey will be joining from the Parent Child Center Network, as well as others, to talk about sort of what impact our policy decisions have on Vermont families at this moment. And then our last session in the series is really the forward-looking, excited piece around sort of what opportunities do we have, both within this legislative session and beyond, to create a program that is fully supportive, accessible, and meets the needs of children, youth, and families. So I'm hoping that folks who are on today are able to join us for the next two sessions. I'm hesitant to get into another question just because we're so close to the 1 o'clock ending time, but I wanted to just take an opportunity to thank everybody, and especially Dr. Felicia Kornbluh and Dr. Donna Pavetti and Olivia Graffeo-Cohen for sharing their expertise with us today, and also to Kit from Voices for coordinating all of these pieces and getting us together. Yeah, I don't know if you want to share just a couple of quick things about sort of upcoming communications, and then we can sign off for today.
Yeah, I just wanted to note that we'll be following up with some resources and the recording next week. And in the meantime, if you'd like to stay connected to our work, I put the link to our mailing list in the chat. So thank you all so much for being here. And we hope to see you over the next couple of weeks as well.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.